Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. We have a good one with the return of James Schmachtenberger. James was the founder of Neurohacker Collective. You may recognize that name from Qualia, his product Qualia. He has a wealth of knowledge in all sorts of shit, but he really has a wealth of knowledge on nootropics, optimization of the brain and body. And we take a deeper dive into this podcast today on longevity and a number of things that can go with that. They have a new product that's phenomenal. But in addition to that, there's obviously so much that we can do for longevity from a lifestyle standpoint and just from a daily choice standpoint that we really dive into and hammer home. So this is an excellent podcast. It's been a minute since I've really just stuck to health in an entire episode. And this is that. If you've been waiting for it, this is that episode. And I'm pumped to have James on. He's a guy that I will have on anytime he wants to come on. So hopefully we can get an annual podcast to catch up. We do save one little tidbit on the world at large at the very end, which was awesome. Just a bit of inspiration there. Without further ado, my brother, James Schmachtenberger. James Schmachtenberger, welcome back to the show, brother.
Thank you. So good to be back. Good to see you, my friend.
It's good to see you as well, brother. Well, I wanted to talk. There's been a lot of people, that have been blowing up the scene in terms of the longevity discussion. You got guys like David Sinclair, Peter Attia just wrote a book, and so it's been a hot topic for a lot of people. I think even for myself, moving from fighting, post fighting, it was like, all right, how do I extend the thing? It was all performance, go go go. Now it's what does longevity look like? How do I heal the brain? And you've been rabbit holing that as well, and have surrounded yourself, with some of the best that I've come across. You got buddies like Dr. Dan Stuckler, and Jamie Wheel, and of course your brother. And so there's so many people you get to spitball ideas with and learn from and grow with. And I think this is going to be a good conversation.
Yeah, I am wildly fortunate that way. I get to spend time with some of the top researchers in that field, and it's so fascinating to get to hear what's at the forefront of it all the time.
Yeah, no doubt. You're in a hell of a think tank. Well, let's talk about the hallmarks of aging. What are the hallmarks of aging? And we'll dive into a little bit on senescent cells and things like that, because I think it's stuff that some people hear about here and there. You might hear like a blip from Dr. Rhonda Patrick on Rogan's or something like that, but right. Really like getting into the nitty gritty of that and what that looks like for us.
Yeah. No, the hallmarks of aging is a really interesting topic that I'm excited to see. It's finally starting to gain some kind of broader understanding and popularity. I mean, basically what it is, kind of the categories within human physiology that are most directly correlated to longevity. And it's kind of an constantly evolving thing, right? There was considered to be 9 hallmarks of aging up until just a handful of months ago, and now there's 12. And there isn't like a specific number that all scientists agree on. It's definitely an evolving domain of science, but the kind of standard understanding was that there was 9, now there's 12. So like, for instance, mitochondrial function would be one of the hallmarks of aging, right? Mitochondria are the part of the cells that are predominantly responsible for energy production. Gross oversimplification, right? But as we age, that starts to decline, and that then kind of speeds up the aging process. You've got things like stem cells would be another hallmark of aging. Dysbiosis, right? What's happening? Again, oversimplification, but what's happening in the gut, right? Because what's happening in terms of your whole microbiome has huge impact. One of the kind of most cutting edge parts of the whole longevity anti-aging space right now is what's known as senescent cells. And this is like one of the newer domains of research, because a lot of things, like we've been studying mitochondria for many, many decades, right? Senescent cells, we've known, like the scientific community has known that they have existed for probably about 30 years, but we had very little understanding of them. We didn't actually know what caused the development of senescent cells. We didn't know that anything could be done about it. That research is like brand new, right? Like most of that only started in 2015. And a lot of that was done out of the Mayo Clinic and out of Scripps, where they started testing different kinds of substances to be able to figure out what could have an impact on reducing the amount of senescent cells. And I guess before we get too far into that, let's just give a maybe high level on what senescent cells are, because it's a term that most people aren't familiar with. They're often referred to as zombie cells, and it's kind of a good visual to think of them that way, right? So a healthy cell is supposed to be able to continue to divide and replicate, and along with that, serve the functions that that cell is supposed to do. Once it gets past the point that it's able to divide and replicate, it's supposed to go through a process known as apoptosis, where the cell dies off. Right? Apoptosis basically means scheduled die-off. And that tends to happen in younger people that are healthy. As we age, and particularly as our immune function gets a little bit less, you get these cells that get past the point of being able to divide and replicate, get past the point of being able to serve their kind of core functions, but they don't die off. And that's where they become senescent or zombie. And there's kind of two key problems with this. One is, as you've got these sort of zombie cells sitting there, they're still sucking up resources, but they're not providing any value. And so that in and of itself is a problem. But where it becomes an even bigger issue is that those senescent cells then emit a series of chemicals that cause the cells around them to also become senescent. And so as you have more senescent cells, everything else starts to become more senescent more quickly, and you see this like kind of rapid acceleration in the aging process. And so being able to address them, being able to minimize the amount of senescent cell buildup is really key. And there's all kinds of things that can be done just in terms of diet, lifestyle, et cetera, to support this, because the key of senescent processes mostly relates to immune function. But in addition to just sort of living a generally healthy life, having good diet, having good exercise, things that are going to kind of support good immune function, there's now this whole field, which is known as senolytics, senolytic being any kind of compound that will remove senescent cells from the body. And so this is an area that we've been diving really deeply into for the last probably 4 or 5 years from an R&D perspective at Neurohacker. And then just last year, we developed and launched a product called Qualia Senolytic that is a combination of 9 different ingredients. Each one targets the sort of die-off or removal of senescent cells in different types of body tissue. And that part's also key, because like most of the research that's been done in that space right now is only focused on removing senescent cells from certain tissues. And so most of the kind of traditional research that's been done out of like Mayo Clinic is using either 1 or 2 compounds. And there's been able to, be identified that you can remove, huge numbers of senescent cells, but only in particular areas. And of course, when we're talking about the concept of longevity, you don't want to have, really healthy muscles and messed up bones, or
my liver's 20 years old, but my kidneys are 80.
Right.
It's not going to work.
And so, and so it's interesting because like the thing that we're doing surprisingly is actually really novel, right? It shouldn't be, right? The basic understanding would be, if we're wanting to support longevity, we're wanting to get rid of senescent cells, you want to do that comprehensively. For whatever reason, most of the research world, most of the kind of product development world hasn't kind of caught on to that concept fully yet.
Is that do you think that's an oversimplification from like a science standpoint? Like I remember talking to Rick Doblin about their protocols with MAPS for MDMA recovery. And we know like 5-HTP and vitamin C, and there's a number of other things that can help on that back end, and their whole thing is just take the day to rest. Like they couldn't include that in the science because it would have been too much to have to figure out dosing of vitamin C, dosing of 5-HTP, how that interacts with different people. And so they just left that off the table for simplicity standpoint from the science perspective. Do you think, Is that something that you think's happening as they study some of these things? Like, look, we're going to stick to one compound. We know it works on the liver. We're only going to look at the liver, and we're going to see how much it does here.
Yeah, I mean, part of it's kind of just a general oversimplification, and part of it has a lot to do with how research is traditionally done, right? The majority of research that we do in the world, kind of regardless of topic, is a sort of reductionist approach, right? And particularly when we talk about medicine, there's almost like not almost, there is a formal mandate to do it that way, right? When you're trying to study something for the purposes of, let's say, FDA approval, you have to control every possible variable. And so as a result, the nature of most clinical studies is that they're really only looking at one or two things at a time. Because as soon as you start to go more complex than that and you're trying to track many different variables, now all of the different things that you have to control for just become so cumbersome and so costly that most people either can't or just aren't willing to do it. And there's not really an economic incentive to, right? Because based on kind of the traditional processes of medicine, if you're studying something, you want it to be a novel molecule that you have the ability to patent and make a fairly obscene amount of money on, which makes sense, right? Like when you're talking about the kind of drug discovery path, it costs companies hundreds of millions, sometimes over $1 billion to be able to bring a drug to market. Right? And so you can't reasonably afford to do all of that research, put all of that money in, if you then don't kind of control that market for a period of time. I'm not saying it should be that way. That's actually quite detrimental to, human well-being, psychology, humanity, but that is kind of the traditional structure. And that's the thing that we've really set out to do differently. And we're not the only group, but we've definitely been kind of pioneering some of this research that's based on, what we refer to as complex systems modeling, right? We're not trying to study one or two variables because you just can't in a bigger picture sense, right? If you change something in physiology, it's not like that's the only thing that changes. There's all of these cascading effects, right? And so to really understand the broader impact, to understand the complexity of how human physiology works and how different interventions affect that, you have to be willing to kind of zoom out and take a much bigger approach. But it's super costly. It's really difficult. It requires scientists from many different disciplines that can all come together in one kind of bigger comprehensive understanding that incorporates deep knowledge in specific subsets brought together into a big picture. And that's really been the thing that has always set Neurohacker apart, or been kind of our unique value, is we were willing to make the investments and go through the hardship of figuring out how to do that kind of complex research. And it's super worthwhile, right? It's insanely hard and it's really pricey, but when we're able to do that and then actually apply that to product development, the results are just incredible, because we're not taking this really simplified approach and saying, well, yeah, we're going to change this one thing and hopefully it's going to do what we want it to do and not do anything else. Right? It doesn't work that way. We're then able to say, hey, we want to upgrade an entire system, an entire way of being, and what is everything that's required to actually do that? And then how do we make that doable and accessible for a broad number of people? It's a super hard undertaking, but it's also amazing and has really extraordinary benefits. Some of which we've gotten to see in pretty wonderful ways so far with this Senolytic product. We're gearing up right now to do a much bigger study, but we've already done 2 studies on that product. Not full clinical trials yet. We're doing kind of smaller pilot studies, which is like a few dozen people. But like one of the main places in the body that senescent cells tend to build up is in joint tissue. And so as a result of that, you see that expressed as all kinds of joint issues, right? Stiffness, discomfort, pain, etc. So we did a study looking at the effects on people's joint health with taking Senolytic versus not. And I mean, I was actually really surprised to see how kind of amazing the benefits were. We had people this particular product isn't something people take every day. It's basically a 2-day cellular detox, and that's something that you do once a month. So in this study, we had people do 3 cycles of this 2-day cellular detox, and we did all the baseline testing before they started and then tested again at the end. And we ended up seeing, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think it was a 43% reduction in joint stiffness, soreness, pain, etc., and something like a 50% increase in this regard, what is referred to as ease of doing daily tasks, right? So have joint issues when you're picking up your kid, when you're taking out the garbage, right? These kinds of things. And so, I mean, to see a change like that in such a short duration with such a simple intervention is just amazing. And so it's been really, really cool to see the effects that product's having, and then how well it's actually taking off, because the implications of that on people's overall health, and then by turn, how much longevity they're likely to have is a really exciting new area in scientific development.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. I mean, it oftentimes the conversation gets pitted one or the other, performance or longevity. Like you're not focusing on both of those typically at the same time. But looking at things holistically, like you guys do, like I would never think like, let's look at the joints. Obviously, I don't know enough about it to know that that's probably a great place to start. But something that is going to help with longevity, and also something very practical right now for former athletes, current athletes, or even if you just never were an athlete and you've got joint pain from being in the modern world. I just love the fact that in a 3-month span, you could shift that far. That's pretty remarkable.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's so cool because, I mean, yeah, most of the time when you're looking at things related to longevity, unless you're actually doing the blood labs and you're seeing what's happening underneath, to an extent, it's almost like you're doing some of it on faith, right? Because you don't feel the effects right away, right? You usually, like, it will have the net benefit over time, but it's not changing your current experience, your current state. So to be able to dive into domains of longevity that not only support, longer lifespan, longer health span, but actually make you feel better, like almost in real time, is pretty new, and it's pretty exceptional. And like, of course, I get excited about the ability to improve quality of life and people's experience in the moment. But then when I start to think about the implications of longevity, bigger picture, that's where I get the most excited. Because like I know for me, I'd say like every, call it 5 years, I kind of do a deep assessment and sort of look at myself, my life, my understanding of universe, of psychology, et cetera. And then I kind of do this reflection on where I was previously. And, like every time I do this, I'm like, wow, there was so much I didn't know. Right. And then the next 5 years happens and it's like, oh my God. Right. So now I start to think about the implications of getting more of those 5-year cycles, and like how much more intelligent we have the opportunity to be, how much wiser, how much more comprehensive, how much more capacity we have to actually make sense of ourselves and of the world around us. And then, what are the implications of that on humanity, right? As people can live longer and more intentionally and be able to develop deeper and deeper understandings of themselves, of the world, it's like, that's going to have massive impact on the choices that we collectively make, the types of technologies that we invest in, the things that we deploy for improving the state of the world. So it's, at the individual level, at the quality of life, it's spectacular. And then you zoom out even a little bit more and you think about the broader implications of longevity. That's a game changer.
Yeah, it's massive. I just think of it like from a mental, emotional point of view. If I'm in pain, I'm not my best self. Like something's weighing on me. I'm kind of can get to be a curmudgeon, if I'm not able to move freely and express through my physical body the way that I know that I can. And if I found myself as an old man just beat up from being a knucklehead as a kid and having a long sports career, I wouldn't want to finish that way. I'd want to finish in a way where even if I die at 80, I'm the very best version of myself, and I could bring, all of my joy and all of the acquired knowledge that I've taken with me and the wisdom with me in a way where I'm not, under the constraints of being in pain or not having the full the fullness of my body in the way that I know that I can.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, obviously as a pro athlete, like you've experienced pain plenty of times, and it's such a huge impact on not just your own quality of life, but the quality of life of everyone around you. Because like you said, you're more prone to being aggravated, to being, short with people, being sharp with people. So like it's not just your experience, it's the experience of everyone around you. And, and obviously there are types of pain that are, kind of structural, fundamental enough that they can't necessarily be gotten rid of. But if there are areas that can be addressed, then let's do it, right? Because you want to be able to have a much richer experience of life. And it's not just about not being crabby. It's like when you're in pain, it sucks up so much of your attention, so much of your total presence. Then that's time that's not going into learning. That's time that's not going into loving the, life that you have, the people around you. It's, time that's not going into deep reflection and introspection, into innovation, right? It's such a resource drain. And so wherever we have the ability to address pain, and not just like acute pain where you're hurting, but just anything that kind of makes life a little blah, right? It's like the goal of life should be to be fully alive. And where can we use research? Where can we use the cutting edge of science to support that? Because when we have the opportunity to be deeply alive, to be fully engaged, the quality of that experience is phenomenal. And the impact that has on everyone around you and ultimately the world at large is phenomenal. To me, that's the goal, right? How do we use research? How do we use science, not to make more money, not to make new, faster widgets, but to actually fundamentally upgrade the experience of being human?
Yeah, I love how you worded that, because that's where I see, the miracle of modern science. Can we have the 1 foot steeped in ancestral wisdom and roots, and then 1 foot with the miracle of modern science, and not move into some kind of weird dystopian transhumanist thing, but use it to advance our beingness, right? Like we have a pretty fucking cool instrument, a pretty cool vehicle that we get to inhabit while we're here. Like I want that to peak. I don't need to merge. We're close enough to the merger already, just with the fact that we've got such access of, within our hands. I don't think it needs to go further than that. But can we improve upon that using science? Like absolutely, we should be.
Right. Yeah, I think for a long time, a lot of the science in the world has been developed in a way that has kind of minimized our humanity. And to me, that's the opposite of what the intent should be. The intent should be like, how do we dive into the right domains of research to support and enhance humanity, not to become more efficient, right? Not to be able to do things that don't actually, we have so much creation of technology and processes and innovation that are all around being able to do things faster and easier. But very seldom are we asking the question, is the thing that we're doing worth doing? Right? Doing something really efficiently that isn't worth doing, why? Let's make sure that the resources that we're allocating to research are starting with the question of, is it worth doing? Is it going to really up-level the experience of humankind? And if so, then yeah, let's go hardcore.
Hell yeah. We got a couple questions on senescent cells. Are there any like you talked about the joints being a place where there seems to be some buildup? Are there any other organs or places within the body where you guys find that you want to look at next scientifically?
Oh yeah. Yeah, because senescent cells show up in every kind of tissue, right? Skin, muscle, bone, eyes, organs, etc. One of the most acute places that people experience it is in joints, but there's buildup almost everywhere. The reason I say almost is there are some areas that just haven't been fully studied. Like scientifically, there's not a lot of understanding of how much senescent buildup there is in eye tissue. Whether that's a thing or not, whether it has an impact on vision, we just don't know. But in most kinds of tissue, there has been sufficient research at this point to know that senescent cells do build up and then cause a cascade of problems. And that's where this approach of, trying to address the topic comprehensively becomes really important. Part of why we've done research so far on joints, then we did another study called the SF36 study. It's sort of a general quality of life study. These are both kind of more subjective approaches of seeing what is the impact of senescent cells. To actually study senescent cells directly and see how many were there before and how many are there after requires biopsying tissue. And so it's a thing I really want to do, and we're working both internally and with outside research organizations to try to figure out the best way to do something along those lines. But that's a very invasive kind of study.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I'm still curious. I was just going to say, I'm still curious along the thinking of where you guys are at with the joints, right? If you know HRV is important and, lower resting heart rate, and then you find that there's a ton of senescent cells within the heart and the cardiovascular system. And in that reduction, does then that improve HRV and improve your lowest resting heart rate at night? That would improve quality of life as well. You'd seem to just be, everything's a little easier when you're in good shape,
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't actually personally know a huge amount about the amount of senescent buildup in heart tissue or, how readily that shifts, because that's just an area that hasn't had substantial research as much as some other areas. On the topic of HRV, we have another product we've developed that seems to have notable impact on that. We haven't actually done a formal HRV study yet, but informally, we've had tons of people, both inside the company and out, that have written in. We developed a product called Resilience. Right? It's a stress resilience product, being able to basically help us navigate the stressors of life more effectively and become more adaptive, right? Because to try to not have... What's that?
I was just going to say, did you launch it in March of 2020?
We should have. Sadly, we weren't done with the R&D quite yet. No, that one we launched, give or take, a year ago. And it's a bunch of different adaptogens, and then a number of other ingredients kind of paired with the adaptogens to maximize their effect. And in some ways it's a subtle product, right? You don't feel like this huge instantaneous difference, but as you take it for a little while, you do find that you're just way more capable of handling what life throws at you, because you can't design a life that doesn't have stress. Right? That's not realistic unless you're going to become a monk and go sit in a cave by yourself and meditate all day. The reality of current modern life is that we're always under time pressure. There's money pressures, there's relational stress, right? You're going to have a lot of stress. So one of the key things about living an exceptional life is, how do we become more adaptive to our environment? How do we handle stress more effectively? Not how do we get away from it? How do we become progressively more capable? And, that was really the goal in the development of Resilience. And, with that, we suspected that we would see changes in HRV because there's a correlation there, but we didn't specifically design for that. So it's been really cool then to see a bunch of people, write in that are using Oura rings or Whoop or other kinds of, biometric tracking devices that are kind of consistently saying something like, hey, I started taking the product and my HRV went up 10 points. That's a big deal, right? I'm sure you've spent time tracking HRV and testing all kinds of variables. There's not a lot of things that move that needle 10 points. And, like I said, we haven't done a formal study there yet, so we can't say definitively that happens. But anecdotally, I've now seen that across a decent number of people, including myself, because I've been doing biometric tracking for 5 years now.
Cool.
Yeah.
Super cool. Well, one more question on senescent cells. Are there any diet and lifestyle behaviors, lifestyle choices that you could do that are going to help with that? Some people have talked about fasting. I'm not sure how sauna and cold or temperature affects that. Can you talk about some of these things that people could potentially get in with, and how does that pair then? Would you, if we were going to do something where I'm all in for 3 months and I wanted to take this, and take my 2-day dose at the beginning of each month for the first 3 months of the year? Is there some lifestyle changes we can add to that would be beneficial and work synergistically?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I mean, you kind of hit it right on the head, which is the number one thing lifestyle wise is fasting, or really intermittent fasting, right? You don't necessarily need to go do a long fast. Like I've done a 40-day juice fast before. That's unnecessary for this purpose. But, when you go at least 16 hours without any caloric intake, there's a process that kicks in the body known as autophagy. Autophagy essentially translates to self-eating, right? And it's where the body then starts to sort of devour old parts that are no longer useful and be able to process them out. There's a huge correlation between autophagy and the removal of senescent cells. And so anytime you're doing intermittent fasting, you're going to, with or without our product, you're going to support a reduction in senescent cells. When you do that, and then you add in senolytics on top of that, then that's going to accelerate dramatically. And like, we don't include that in like the standard product recommendation because not everyone's willing to do intermittent fasting. But if you are, that's going to be a really key area. And obviously, intermittent fasting started to gain huge amounts of popularity in the last few years. And you have kind of the standard version of it, which is, you only eat within an 8-hour window each day. And then the remaining 16 hours, you don't take anything else in other than basically water. And for many people, that's a pretty hard version. So another thing that works really well in that same regard is what's known as fasting mimicking. And there's a bunch of different programs out there. The most popular one by far is a company called Prolon. I have no involvement, but they make a product for fast mimicking where you actually do get to eat and drink a little bit throughout the day. You don't have to take a full 16 hours away, but the nature of what's in their product being, very low calorie, very high fiber content, etc., basically causes your body to think that it's fasting. And so you get a lot of that benefit of autophagy. You get the support for removing senescent cells, but in a way that's a little bit more user-friendly because you're not sitting there starving quite as much. So, straight up fasting, intermittent fasting, or fast mimicking would be some of like the core lifestyle pieces. Exercise is actually an interesting one because when you do intense exercise, it actually increases the amount of senescent cells immediately following exercise. But it also supports better immune function. And so net, it will actually reduce the number of senescent cells, but it's not a totally consistent thing. It's going to basically go up and down because the amount of stress that you're putting your body under doing hard exercise will basically cause some of the healthy cells to move into senescence. But relatively shortly after that, they'll then start to clear out. So exercise is key. And then good quality sleep, right? Because again, removing senescent cells is largely a function of the immune system. One of the absolute best things that someone can do to support healthy immune function or improve immune function is get really good sleep. And it's one of the things that as a society we suck at the most, right? We tend to overvalue the grind and undervalue the necessity of rest and restoration. And so, for many people, we don't sleep enough. We sleep with really inconsistent hours. We are staring at our phones right up until we go to sleep, which is, causing all kinds of issues from the flickering lights and the blue lights, right? So like lifestyle wise, you've got fasting, you've got exercise, and then sleep. And most people know how to get better sleep, but they don't choose to do the necessary steps, right? Put the screens away at least an hour before bed, have a pretty consistent schedule, spend that last 30 or 60 minutes before bed actually doing practices to wind down, right? Spend that time meditating, journaling, having a kind of reflective experience on your own or with your partner. Those would be kind of the core elements. The one other thing that's key is, the amount of polyphenols that you get in your diet are going to have a huge impact on senescent cells. So basically what that means is eat more fresh fruits and vegetables, particularly colored ones. The brighter the colors and the fresher they are, the higher the polyphenol content, and the more benefit you're going to get, not just on senescent cells, but kind of across everything. And again, all stuff we know, right? It's just how much do we choose to apply to our lives. We all know we should eat a lot more fresh food, a lot more fruits and veggies. Sometimes it's not quite as attractive as the ice cream. The more that we can make choices in the moment that align with our deeper goals and intent for life, the better quality of life that we're going to have.
Yeah. I've had a weird shift for me recently this year was prioritizing sleep, because when parenting, I put the kids down. It's like my time to be intimate with my wife, or I'm going to deep dive a book that I've been dying to read, because it's the first time I have the opportunity to read all day long, or listen to Audible before I go to bed. And now I'm trying to time it that I go to sleep right when the kids go to sleep. So I'll no Audible, no nothing. I'll close my eyes and meditate for a bit around 8:30, and I'm out by 9 o'clock. And just that reframe is adding hours to my sleep. Like I wake up completely refreshed. And it's interesting because we've got like amber bulbs and blue light blocking glasses and stuff like that if we're going to read. Even Audible is like, I can put that on and I have no lights on. So it's like a really easy way for me to consume information, and that's me time. But the switch, like sleep's actually me time too. If I can substitute that and see how it works. And it's been a really cool experiment. I'd stay up for 2-3 hours listening to the book. That's really good. Like that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to chew it up. And like, holy shit, it's 11 o'clock. I missed my nice window of getting to bed on time.
Well, that's the tricky part, right? Because audiobooks are actually a pretty good thing to do generally before sleep, right? Because staring at a screen is problematic, but, allowing kind of, passively to take in insights, to take in information, it is still somewhat stimulating, but compared to many of the things that people do, it's actually pretty good.
I wouldn't listen to the real Anthony Fauci before bed. That might keep you awake.
Yeah, I mean, what you listen to definitely matters, right? If it's something that's getting you all riled up, well, that's not going to be super helpful. Whereas if it's like a book of poetry or philosophy and you're just like in a reflective state, well, that's probably actually going to work pretty well. So, I mean, it's interesting because like I often tell people to start doing more audiobooks because it's a better alternative than doom scrolling on Facebook or watching TV, right? And so if, because there's always like, what is the ideal? And for most people, the ideal is not realistic, or even if it is, it's not realistic right now. And so then it's like, what are the progressive steps that you can take? And, audiobooks are a pretty good progressive step for most people. I will also say on the intimacy part, there are things that provide a lot of the same benefit that sleep does, and sometimes even more, that in my personal opinion are at times worth giving up a little bit of sleep for, right? Like for instance, There's tons of studies showing the effects of meditation, and there's so much restoration that happens both, psychologically and emotionally, but as well as physiologically when you meditate, that if you were to, meditate for 30 minutes and you had to give up an hour of sleep to do that, net, that's actually probably good. And though there's less research on it, personally, my view is that intimacy is also one of those areas that, if you can, maybe give up something else, give up some work time, give up some distraction time. But if the only option is give up a little bit of sleep time to have intimacy, the amount of deep fulfillment that comes from that, like the amount of really good, fun, exciting neurotransmitter production, endorphin production, but also, just like the deeper kind of spiritual aspects of intimacy and how much that brings us closer to who we are. I am personally pretty routinely willing to give up a little bit of sleep to have more intimacy.
Yeah. Well, I love, when Mark Gaffney talks about that, he's like, at the moment of climax, nobody's sitting there asking themselves, why am I here? What is the meaning of all this? What is my purpose in life? Like
right.
It's understood. It's understood. There's no questions like that. There's no wondering about, the doom of the future or any of that shit. Like, it all makes sense in that moment. It certainly makes sense to me as he describes that. Yeah.
Well, kind of like what we were talking about earlier, right? Like that's one of the most acute experiences of being fully alive, right? And when you're fully alive, yeah, there's no questions, right? You're not in an existential breakdown. You're not wondering, am I doing the right things with my life? Am I, making the right choices? Am I where I'm supposed to be? No, you're fully fucking engaged. And, there's a bunch of things that can bring us to that. Sexual intimacy happens to be one of the best and one of my personal favorites.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, let's dive into, I think we talked about it a bit in the first podcast, but it has been a couple years. So I'd love for you to talk about your personal stories surrounding experiences with healing the brain and burnout. And obviously that can bridge us the gap to nootropics. And you guys, I think Neurohacker Collective is best known for Qualia, but obviously you guys are still in the game creating awesome stuff and haven't stopped there. But I'd love to rehash some of that and talk a bit about your own personal journey.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So most of my life has been kind of dedicated to the domain of sort of alternative medicine and, for lack of a better way of saying it, let's say personal development, right? Psychology, alternative approaches to psychology. So working on some of these things is not new for me, but some of the experiences I had along the way drove kind of where we are today. When I was 18, I was a student at a vocational college studying alternative medicine and alternative psychology. And I absolutely loved it. Like I had already dropped out of college 3 times prior to that, was very bored with like traditional forms of academics. But as soon as I got like directly into the healing field and I saw the impact it was having on me, the impact it was having on other people, I was just like, I was in my dharma. I was totally on purpose. And so right around the time that I was getting ready to graduate, the man that had founded the college that I was going to had said that he wanted to kind of semi-retire. He still wanted to teach, he still wanted to have private practice, but he no longer wanted to own and run business. And in my excited naivete of being an 18-year-old, I'm like, oh, I should do that. Now, I had no idea what the fuck I was doing. I had no money. So I gave him a $1,500 advance on my credit card, which was the extent of the money that I had in the world, to like hold it. So I had time to go raise money. And then, I went around and begged everyone I had ever met for money and ended up actually buying the school. And it was this really interesting experience because I so loved what I was doing. Like I couldn't have been more on purpose, but I was so profoundly overwhelmed, right? Like at 18, I didn't know how to balance a checkbook. I didn't know how to manage employees. And all of a sudden I have like dozens of employees, hundreds of students, no idea what the hell I'm doing. And so I basically made up for my lack of knowledge with just work hours. And for the first 3 years, I worked basically 20 hours a day, 7 days a week. Much of the time I didn't go home because it didn't make sense to add the commute time on. I would lay down under my desk, nap, get back up and start working again. And when I wasn't directly working on the business, I was taking a business class. I was studying marketing. And by the time I was 21, even though at that age, you're built to be able to handle a lot, but no one's supposed to go 3 years without sleeping. And so I ended up in just terrible shape. I was depressed. I had no energy. My memory was so messed up, particularly my working memory. Working memory is sort of how much information you can hold in a given moment. And I ended up having this problem where when I would try to read anything, by the time I would get to the end of a sentence, I couldn't remember where the sentence started. So I couldn't make sense of any of it. Right? That was the problem with working memory. And, then like being depressed and being low energy while feeling like I'm doing the thing I'm supposed to be doing in the world, then that caused an existential breakdown. I'm like, what the fuck's wrong with me? Right? And I ended up going to a doctor at the time and got diagnosed with stage 3 adrenal exhaustion. Right? When you go past that, you get into basically what's known as Addison's disease, where the adrenals just kind of fundamentally give out and you have to take cortisol exogenously for the rest of your life. Luckily, I wasn't quite there, but I wasn't far from it. And so that was kind of where I dove originally into like the biggest part of my healing journey. And I did all kinds of things, but there was one thing that really made the most profound difference. I ended up going to this clinic in Mexico and met with this research physician who had developed this new kind of cutting edge IV therapy for rapidly healing neurotransmitter damage. And I ended up doing 3 days in a row of this IV for like 9 hours a day. And it was a massive game changer. Like it was, most things that you do to improve your health are kind of like slow and subtle. And this just wasn't. It was like the lights came back on. My memory started working again. The depression totally went away. I ended up not only feeling like I got all of my brain function back to where I had previously experienced it, but actually had significantly more cognitive ability than I ever had before. All the depression kind of left and got replaced with a sense of like excitement and passion for life, more capacity. And then the piece that really stood out to me was that as I became healthier with that, as I became more resourced and I had more ability to kind of hold a bigger picture, my empathy went through the roof. And just like as an almost automatic function, I could no longer think about anything I wanted to do in the world and not just automatically be aware of how it was going to affect everyone around me and what effects it would have on the world. And as I was just reflecting on that experience, I was like, my God, this is like personally, this is incredible. And if I think about this collectively, if I think about the opportunity for everyone to have that kind of experience of becoming dramatically more intelligent, much more capable, more confident, having a better experience of life, and becoming more empathetic so that their intelligence and their competency start to be used for progressively better things, right? Not just for personal gain, not just for competition, but how do I impact my family, my community, and ultimately the world? I was like, that's a game changer. And so that ended up becoming the thing that I wanted to devote my life to. And originally, I actually tried to partner with that doctor, and I was going to open IV clinics all over the world, doing this therapy, having a nonprofit arm that would fund having a for-profit arm that would fund a nonprofit arm to give it to the people who couldn't afford it. And we actually started on that process, and just a few weeks into it, he ended up getting ill and passed away. And most of his research went with him. And so there was this beautiful vision and no longer a path. And then, that's kind of where, while I was building other companies and doing other things, like in the background, I was researching this stuff. I was like interviewing all the top neuroscientists, neurobiologists, chemists, formulators, and like telling them of this grand vision. And, everyone was like, yeah, it's beautiful. It's not possible. And it wasn't until we were able to find the right people and bring this complex system science concept together in a really tangible fashion, where from that scientific model, we could actually understand how the brain and the nervous system worked in a deep enough way to have that kind of meaningful benefit. And that ended up being essentially the creation of Neurohacker. The first product that we made was a product called Qualia Mind. It's this broad spectrum nootropic, right, designed to support and enhance all different types of brain function, not just make you more focused. That's helpful. But in addition to focus, like you need to have better critical thinking skills, better discernment, better capacity to make sense of the world, better reasoning. And then along with being able to support better brain function, we tried to take this approach to formulate in a way that would also tap into and support the parts of the brain and nervous system responsible for things like compassion and empathy, and to, sort of upgrade our subjective experience of life. How do we feel about ourselves? How do we feel about the world? How do we feel about the way that we interface with that? And then the goal there was, how do we make it really accessible, right? Because most people aren't going to do the thing that I did. You're not going to go to some random clinic in another country and have people shove stuff in your veins that's really expensive and super uncomfortable and do that for days on end. As much as I want everyone to have that experience, like, it's just not realistic at scale. So, the approach that we took was, how do we give as much of that type of experience as is possibly doable in a capsule? Because that's now fairly simple. And the reality is, you can't do as much going through the digestive tract as you can IV. Just the way physiology works, it's nearly not impossible. So, what we created isn't necessarily going to do everything that I experienced in that IV, but it's the closest thing that I've ever seen to what that experience was. That's actually available to people in a fairly straightforward, simple, and actually doable way. And that was the creation of Neurohacker. Since then, we've obviously expanded. We've developed more products in the cognitive sector, really tried to develop those abilities more and more, but also recognize that the kind of science that it took to make something that could dramatically improve people's thinking, their subjective experience, that same type of science could also be applied to many other areas of life, with longevity being one of the key areas of importance. And so, now we've developed products across a number of different areas, but I'd say brain function and longevity have become kind of our two primary wheelhouses that we've invested the most research in, that we've kind of built a whole team around.
Yeah, I remember the first time I was at PaleoFX, you guys had a table there, and I wasn't on it yet, and I was just looking over. Somebody had given me some on day one, and I was like, holy shit, what is this stuff? So I went running back there right when PaleoFX opened up day two. And I remember reading the label, and I was like, I had dabbled in various nootropics, from the Russian stuff to Alpha Brain and everything in between. And I remember looking at the label, and I was like, this is like the kitchen sink. It's like, I knew enough about it to understand too that it wasn't just things that were going to give me a spark or help me in the now. There was long-term benefit to it. There was things that were actually healing for the brain, and it was a whole systems approach, which I found absolutely incredible. Like, you guys left nothing out from that. It was really like the one nootropic to rule them all. It was pretty cool to see that.
It was kind of the goal. And, and it has its pluses and minuses, right? Like, the downside of the approach that we take is it's more capsules than almost any other product on the market, right? Because to try to get as significant of an effect as we are across as many things as we are, there's a lot of different active ingredients that have to go in. And then when you're using full therapeutic doses of each of them, you end up needing to take, depending on the product, 4 to maybe 8 capsules. And so it's that's a bit of an inconvenience. But when you put that up against how dramatic of a difference you can experience in your quality of life, your thinking, your overall health, your vitality, it's worth the hardship. Hopefully over time we'll figure out ways of making things progressively more concentrated. But right now it's there's a trade-off between capsule count and total impact.
Yeah, I don't know. I get it. Like, some people complain about shit like that. I've had, especially when I was guinea pig and everything on it, my wife and I got 2 shot glasses, and we don't drink alcohol, but the shot glasses were just to fill up the capsules we were going to take in the morning and the evening.
Yep.
It's like, all right, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But the juice is worth the squeeze. It's one of the things where 3 days in, you're like, I don't give a fuck if it's 8 capsules. Like, this right. is working for me in ways that nothing else does. And I think that's, the proof's in the pudding there. That just becomes, a minor side effect to get the results that you want.
That's how I feel about it too. And most people do once they get there, right? Sometimes the idea initially is a little daunting, but it's like, a lot of things that make life better take some effort, right? Exercise takes effort, but everyone who's done exercise consistently is really clear that the amount of effort and soreness and everything that goes into it is so incredibly worth it based on how much more energy you have, how much more powerful, capable, happier, right? So it's a similar concept here.
Yeah, even going without food takes a lot of effort, right? You're doing 16-8 like that.
Right.
Surprisingly takes quite a bit of effort to withhold and just keep drinking water. So I get that. What are 3 to 5 go-tos for upgrading mental energy, lifting brain fog that our listeners could put into practice today?
One of the obvious ones would be take a really great nootropic product. I happen to be, biased and partial to some of the stuff that we make, particularly Qualia Mind. And in many ways, like that will in and of itself have a huge impact, and you'll get more impact from it if you're doing some of the other things that also support better brain function. And it's funny because almost everything comes back to the same stuff, right? Good sleep, good diet, good exercise. There's way more than that, but get the fundamentals in place. Right? In terms of brain function, I would say, sleep is probably the single biggest thing, at least for most people, right? Because most people are really struggling there. When you really spend the effort to dial in good sleep quality, we've all had the experience, right? You wake up the next day and you're just more clear. You're refreshed. You're ready to take on the day. And rather than feeling scared and overwhelmed by it, you're like, oh, I get to do all of this, right? So, really dialing that in. Obviously, eating in a way that is supportive of energy production, supportive of the brain. So less sugary shit, less fried foods, more live foods, healthy balances of proteins and carbs and all that. Some of the other biohacks that are really awesome that are, gaining a lot more popularity now, like cold plunge, spectacular. Cold plunge does so many things that, have effects across all kinds of stuff, right? Better recovery time, better immune function, but very specifically and very directly going to positively impact brain function. Both in the sense of increased cognitive performance, but also in the sense of increased resilience. One of my favorite things about doing cold plunge is that when I make the conscious choice every day to go torture myself in freezing cold water, everything else feels less difficult.
Yeah.
Right? That hard meeting that I have to go to, I'm like, dude, I just got out of 32-degree water. Bring it on. So cold plunge is a really spectacular one. And then within the realm of exercise, all exercise is going to be good. High intensity exercise typically is going to have the most impact on brain function, even if it's really short, right? And that's why you see things like a lot of public speakers and such will backstage, 5 minutes before they go on, they'll do a bunch of jumping jacks, run in place really intensely for a minute. It doesn't necessarily take a long duration, but just going full out, letting your heart rate really elevate, getting your respiration going, has a pretty immediate effect on brain function, but also when you do it consistently, then has long-term positive impacts.
Yeah, it seems like the closer you are to a real life threat, if you were going for a jog at 12 mile per hour pace, it's not the same as trying to outrun a bear. If you're sprinting
right.
Full go, that's your body adapts differently. If you're in a 32 degree or 35 degree ice bath, that's different on the physiology than taking a cold shower, that's 50 degrees or 60 degrees. It's just the results come quicker, it seems. And that's kind of been my rule of thumb. Typically volume's going to come down when the intensity goes up. You could stay in a 55 degree ice bath for an hour. I don't have an hour. Give me 3 minutes, 2-3 minutes in a really cold one, and then you feel it. It goes beyond what we're talking about. It becomes a visceral experience.
Oh yeah. 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 We don't have time for it now, but when you really get into sort of how our biology developed over duration, you start to see really clearly why high intensity brings a lot more mental clarity. right? Because when you're being chased by a bear, you better be really clear. You can't have a complicated brain at that time. You can't be thinking about your shopping list or what you got to do tomorrow. You got to be able to be wholly and entirely present to and addressing the thing in front of you. That kind of intensity, has been something that has sort of biologically, evolutionarily developed. And, now for the most part, we're not being chased by bears, but we can mimic some of the experiences through leaning into physical intensity.
I like that. Well, we're coming up here in an hour, but I'd love to leave you with a question since we talked briefly about it. Obviously, I'll leave a loaded question for you at the end of it. We don't have tons of time to get into it, but a lot has changed in the last 2 years since we spoke last. And one of the things that I love in following you and Dan Stickler and your brother Daniel is that you guys are often thinking about the big picture. You're often thinking about the world at large. Everything changed, in 2020, and obviously there's been stints before that were big landmarks across recent history. But how do you come into a place of alchemy when you're thinking about existential risk and different things going on, or even something that may not be existential, but it's like the employment of centralized bank digital currency and cameras on every street light, things like that. What are the things that allow you to process that and continue to move forward and not let it weigh on you?
I mean, mostly I just curl up in fetal position and cry a lot. No, I mean, it's a really good question. And that's obviously a whole podcast in and of itself, but to try to do a short version, I focus on building more capacity. Right. The world that we live in today is, spectacular in so many ways. And the amount of opportunities, the amount of, technology, insight accessible to us is incredible. And the amount of risks are higher than they've ever been, and in progressively more and more existential ways. I would say we're a lot closer now than we were 2 years ago to the reasonable probability that human life will end. That's a hard thing to actually deal with, right? And most people have very little understanding of it, partly because it's not yet a popular enough conversation, but also because most people don't feel like they have the wherewithal to be able to actually lean into that understanding and then start to look at what can I do to affect the outcomes, not only for myself, but for civilization at large. And, there's so many individual things that need done, but ultimately what I think a lot of it comes down to at the individual level is how do we develop more resilience? How do we develop more capacity? How do we get to a place in our mind and our bodies and our life to feel like we have the willingness and the ability to actually face reality, to not just want to put our head in the sand and pretend that it's all going to be okay, but to recognize and acknowledge there's a really good chance it's not. And within that frame, how do I show up bigger and bigger and bigger? And then within that capacity of showing up bigger, what is it that is uniquely mine to do in the world? Right? Because there's work that needs done on infrastructure, there's work that needs done on technology, there's work that needs done on psychology, on education, right? There's not a should in terms of what some specific person should do. When you start to really focus on building individual capacity and broadening your understanding of life, the world, then for most people, there's sort of this naturally emergent process that starts to then self-identify what it is that's yours to do. And, for some people, it's as simple as what's mine to do is to make the lives of the other people around me better, right? And then you just invest in making everyone smile, right? You become more humorous, you become appreciative, you show your love for people, right? And for some people, it's like, oh, I'm going to develop an entirely new technology that's going to revolutionize an industry that is destroying the planet, right? All of them are needed. But it starts with the willingness to actually understand and face reality, and the fundamental necessity to increase capacity so that you can do that. And then most of the rest of it does tend to just sort of naturally unfold.
I love that. That was brilliant. For a short answer, I couldn't have asked for one better. So I appreciate it, brother, and I appreciate your time. Anytime you want to come on, you're welcome. I love the conversations we get to have. And let us know where people can find your amazing products and where people can see you online.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, first, just, thanks for having me. It was super fun last time. Really fun to see you this time. I look forward to when we get to do it again. If people want to learn more about me, about the research that we're doing, you can go to neurohacker.com, and you can see about all the products, the Senolytic that we talked about. But also, even if you're not interested in product, we have such a tremendous amount of research and information available now. And so, whether you're going to take the products or not, like a lot of the R&D that we've made available to understanding human physiology, understanding how to improve quality of life, just tons and tons of articles, podcasts, everything there. So check out neurohacker.com.
Cool. Thank you so much, brother. We'll do it again.
Thank you.